Welcome to Thinking Green. Tonight's show will be a little bit different. I guess they all are. 44 years ago, and a couple of days, on May 4th, 1970, many of us of my age, were quite shocked to hear about the events at Kent State. I was living out of the country at the time, so the facts trickled out very slowly, but it's been kind of a defining moment in the history of the anti-war movement. So tonight's guest, I'm very pleased, is Mike Alewitz. He was an eyewitness. He was a student activist at Kent State in 1970, a lifelong peace and justice activist, and also an artist. He paints murals. And Mike is here to tell us about what he saw and what it means for us today. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
And having said that, I'm going to just hand it over to you, and you can present your information.
Well, that's good, because actually we're going to be looking mostly at slides, not at my face, which is a fortunate thing. Because unlike other famous incidents like this, the massacre at Soweto or what happened in Mexico City in 1968, on May 4th of 1970, there was a lot of photography going on the campus at Kent State. And so we have a remarkable record of what occurred there. But before we get into that, I want to actually back up and lay a bit of the political framework for what happened at Kent State in May of 1970. And to do that, I want to take a trip first to Vietnam and what was going on there. American intervention really began to escalate under the Kennedy administration, and the U.S. was involved in Vietnam from 1960 until the final defeat of U.S. forces in 1975. During that time, there were over 58,000 American GIs who died in Southeast Asia. 2,500 were missing and likely dead. Over 330,000 GIs were wounded or paralyzed. That horror paled in comparison to what was done to the people of Southeast Asia. The idea that this myth by the ruling class that their hands were tied in Vietnam and that's why the U.S. did not win is utter nonsense. Death and destruction rained down on the people of Southeast Asia. Over 2 million Vietnamese, Kampuchean, and Laotians died. Over 14 million refugees were created. 300,000 orphans, and fully 10% of the land of Vietnam was defoliated. Well, that carnage that we witnessed on TV was met by an unprecedented movement, unprecedented in the history of this country, in the history of the world, a mass anti-war movement that grew up and was active during the actual shooting war itself. This had never happened before. And that happened, part of that was happening at Kent State, my little campus in the middle of Ohio. Kent State was a working class university. We were the children of Akron rubber workers, Youngstown steel workers, Cleveland auto workers. It was a big industrial area. Those industries are all gone now. But at Kent, the Kent Committee Against the War, and later the Kent Student Mobilization Committee primarily, were the anti-war coalitions that mobilized students, including in demonstrations like this 1969 October 15th anti-war moratorium. One of my earliest pieces of art is that banner that's being held by students at the front of that demonstration. So the student strike that would develop in 1970 after the shootings at Kent was preceded by these mobilizations on university campuses all across the country, hundreds, thousands of students marching, protesting against the war. Here, behind that banner is, on the right, is Allison Krauss, one of the students who was murdered on the 4th. And here, this was a newspaper, the Daily Kent Stater. I was a columnist for the Daily Kent Stater, the socialist columnist. And here, Allison had been shown at being active at the moratorium. She was there collecting money for the Student Mobilization Committee, which I was chair of. And you can see how proud she was of her activity. And I show this image because oftentimes, to the extent there's any media coverage, students are portrayed merely as victims, not as the activists that they were, that these were young people who went out into the streets fully knowing that they were part of a movement to change society. Well, on April 30th of 1970, a very nervous-looking Richard Nixon went on television to announce the U.S. invasion of Cambodia, which was a major escalation of the war in Southeast Asia. And it was met with universal outrage. On Friday, May 1st at noon at Kent, there was a rally of 500 students called by the history graduate students, at which time they symbolically buried the United States Constitution, because, of course, the Constitution says that only Congress has the ability to declare war. The rally took place on the Commons, and this area will figure in later in some of the slides that I show you. The Commons was the traditional free speech area on the campus. It's hard for us to realize now, and most people won't remember, but prior to the anti-Vietnam War movement, the question of your ability to distribute literature, hold rallies, hold protests, and carry on activities had not been established on many universities or high schools around the country. We won that right during the course of the anti-Vietnam War movement. That day there was also another rally, again sponsored, again on the Commons, sponsored by the Black United Front of about 400 students as well. Well, on Friday, May 1st, there was unrest in downtown Kent. Kent was a college town. There were a lot of bars along Water Street there. And there was often troubles in the area that comes with having young people around. But in this particular time, and obviously students were very angry about what was going on with the war, there were some bonfires and broken windows, but basically it was no big deal. However, the mayor of the city, Leroy Satram, used the incident as an excuse to call for troops to be sent in, call for the National Guard to be sent in. On Saturday, May 2nd, the Guard arrived, and there was a protest of 2,000 students, at which time the ROTC building was burned down. It was one of a couple dozen or more that were burned down across the country. That sounds pretty serious, but in fact, what the ROTC building was a dilapidated wooden structure that was scheduled for destruction. It was one of these one-floor temporary structures that had been built in the 1940s, I believe. And the way the whole thing occurred was very suspicious because there was no attempt by the police to stop the burning of the ROTC. It had all the earmarkings of what we later learned from the COINTELPRO documents about the use of agent provocateurs and police provocations in order to provide a justification for repression against the students. That evening and for the next couple nights, the National Guard pursued students on the campus, chasing them into dormitories, launching tear gas barrages, and basically harassing students. Well, on Sunday, May 3rd, Governor James Rhodes, who was running for U.S. Senate, arrived on the campus and held a much publicized press conference. He did it standing in front of these rifles with the implication that there were armed students on the campus, when in fact these were non-functioning props that were used by ROTC students for when they were learning how to march around campus. Governor Rhodes used the pretext of the ROTC burning to lay the basis for the shootings with his provocative political statements. He said, quote, "When the technique of the Weathermen and the SDS and the Student Mobilization Committee, when this is employed in firebombing and violence, and let me say also that death is not going to stand in their way to answer their purpose. We're up against the strongest well-trained militant revolutionary group ever assembled in America. No one is safe in Portage County. It's just that simple. No one is safe, end quote. He went on to say, these protesters are the worst type of people we harbor in America, worse than the brown shirts and the communist element. We will use whatever force is necessary to drive them out of Kent, end quote. At the same time that he was saying this, Nixon was calling student protesters bums. What they were doing was laying the basis for the repression that was to come. Again, on Sunday evening, May 3rd, students, we sat down at the entryway to the campus and were met with guardsmen. Students were bayoneted. Helicopters flew overhead. It was like a scene in an occupied country. Tear gas inundated the campus, and many students were injured. Well, on May 4th, a lot of students who were commuters arrived back on the campus to find that their campus was under martial law. And when that happened, there was a lot of fraternizing with the National Guardsmen. Most of the National Guardsmen were actually in the Guard as a way of avoiding Vietnam, because that was a central question for our generation. Not, where am I going to go to school or what's my career, but how am I going to avoid Vietnam? And a lot of people avoided it. At that time, you could do this by going into the Guard. And there was always a lot of fraternization. From its inception, the anti-war movement always reached out to active duty GIs, whether they were in the Guard, whether they were in the Army, whether in the Navy. The idea that students viewed the soldiers as enemies is nonsense and was fabricated as a way to sow distrust between students and soldiers, and I'll show some slides about that later on. This is a famous photo of a guardsman with a flower which was purportedly put into the barrel by Allison Krauss, who said flowers are better than bullets. Well, at noon on May 4th, about 1,500 students gathered on the Commons, the free speech area of the campus, to protest the war and the occupation of our campus. At the other end of the Commons, the guardsmen were formed up in a line. A jeep left the guardsmen and approached us that contained General Robert Canterbury, and through a bullhorn he ordered us to give up our rights to protest and to immediately disperse. Students responded with jeers and chants to assert their right to peacefully protest. And it was a very peaceful protest. It was a warm spring day. There was very little tension in the crowd. The guardsmen formed a skirmish line of approximately 116 men, equipped with loaded assault weapons and fixed bayonets. This is what it looked like when they did that, from where we were at the top of the hill. That's called Blanket Hill. Soldiers donned gas masks and began to advance on us. As they did so, we began to leave the area. But there was a huge barrage of tear gas as the guardsmen advanced. If any of you have ever been in tear gas, you know that at this point the demonstration is broken up. You can't be in a cloud of gas like that. Here they are approaching, lobbing the tear gas at students who are leaving. Some students tried to throw it back, but an enormous cloud of gas. At that point, I was partially blinded and ran into one of the buildings that's right to the left here in order to wash out my eyes. Here we see the guardsmen chasing the remnants of student protesters over the top of the hill. I ran into Taylor Hall there, right outside where I was. You see a guardsman attacking a student. There's the guardsmen at the top of the hill, and they march down to a practice field on the other side of Taylor Hall and Blanket Hill. And that's actually General Del Corso of the Ohio National Guard throwing rocks at the students and calling us pigs. And I am down by that fence there. I could be even one of those figures there, I don't know, but I was down around in that area at that time. The guardsmen marched into the middle of the practice field and knelt and raised their weapons. This is what it looked like at that point. You can see that there is no one threatening the guardsmen, and there is no one even remotely near them. Then they got up, turned around, and began to march back towards the Commons over Blanket Hill. They marched up the hill towards a pagoda that's there. And as they arrived at the top of the hill, they simultaneously turned and fired. Note the officer on the far left with a handgun. Obviously, an order was given to fire. Students ran for cover. This is what it looked like moments after the shots were fired. The shots where you see all the gas, that's where the guardsmen are. They're actually further away than what you see here. Allison Krauss was 330 feet away from the nearest guardsman when she was fatally gunned down. My friend Sandy Scheuer was 390 feet away, walking to class. She wasn't even at the demonstration that day. She was shot through the neck and killed. Another friend of mine, Robbie Stamps, was almost 500 feet away when he was wounded. 67 shots were fired in 13 seconds. This is Bill Schroeder, one of the slain students, who was himself an ROTC student. It's a very famous, iconic image of the shootings. Mary Del Vecchio, who was visiting the campus that day. This is Jeffrey Miller as he lay dying. This is a student who had a flag. He took the flag and he dipped it into the blood of one of the students. He began to jump up in this pool of blood that was on the cement. That's me directly behind him with a white armband. Dean Kaler was paralyzed from the waist down for life. The four dead were Jeff Miller, Bill Schroeder, Allison Krauss, Sandy Scheuer. This is Sandy with my brother's dog, Heavy. Between the two people holding hands in this photo, this is before the shootings, you see that there's a person standing with his back towards us. That man's name is Terry Norman. He was an FBI informant. And if you look closely at this photo, it's a little difficult to see because of the shot itself. He has just handed a handgun to a police officer right after the shootings. He was an FBI informant. He was armed in the crowd that day. The first reports that came out in the media were that the guardsmen had responded to sniper fire from the students, and yet Terry Norman has never been publicly questioned about FBI involvement in the massacre at Kent State. There he is when he ran. He was being chased because people thought he was shooting, and he was chased and he ran to the guardsmen. After the shootings, I was asked to go to Washington to participate in an anti-war action. The fellow on the right is Tim Butts, who was an anti-war activist, and he was also a Vietnam veteran. As we were leaving town by this old railroad station that you see down there on the left, we were stopped by vigilantes who were cruising looking for students, put up against a wall. We had M2s against our heads and came very close to being executed that day. A police car came along and we were arrested. And I have to say, it was one of the few moments in my life where I was ever glad to see a cop. I was on my way to help on this demonstration. There was a mass demonstration in Washington, D.C. that was called on very short notice on May 9th. Between 150 and 500,000, depending on what you read. People were there at this huge demonstration, including Jane Fonda, who spoke. This is a famous shot of her at the demonstration. It's famous not so much for Jane Fonda, but for who's behind her. That face behind her is Kerry. During his brief flirtation with being an anti-war activist, who is now one of the main mouthpieces for U.S. war-making overseas. This is the protest in Washington. Well, the bloodshed was not over. Although you don't hear much about it, there were two other very important incidents. One was on May 11th in 1970, when the burned and tortured body of a 16-year-old black retarded youth named Charles Oatman was dumped by Richmond County jailers at a hospital in Augusta, Georgia. And what happened following that, that's on May 11th, was that there was a rebellion in the black community that left 6 black men dead. All 6 men were shot in the back by the police. And 10 days after Kent came Jackson State. At Jackson State, cops opened fire on a women's dormitory and in a barrage of over 450 bullets at unarmed students. One witness described it as, "I heard a sound like 100 freight trains." It left 2 dead and an unknown number of students wounded because black students, because of the history of racism in Jackson, were afraid to go to the hospital. See, at Kent, the wounded white kids went to the hospital. But at Jackson, people feared that they would be charged with stuff. So we don't really know how many people were wounded at Jackson State. The dead were James Earl Green. He was a 17-year-old senior in high school who was just passing through campus on his way home after his after-school job. He was one of 8 children. His father had died when he was young, and his mother had recently remarried a laborer. He was the star of his track team. He worked in a grocery store, gave his check to his mom. Just a very popular, well-liked kid who was gunned down. Philip Gibbs was the son of a sharecropper. He had recently married his high school sweetheart, and they had a small child. And he was active on the Civil Rights Council at Jackson State, and he was killed. Jackson had a long and bloody history of racist oppression. In 1962, as a result of riots by racist mobs protesting the enrollment of James Meredith at the University of Mississippi, the city was placed under martial law by Congress and President John F. Kennedy. It was the only U.S. city to hold this distinction during the 20th century. It was in Jackson on June 12, 1963, that Medgar Evers, civil rights activist and leader of the Mississippi NAACP, was gunned down by Klansman Byron Della Beckworth. In 2 1964 trials with all-white juries that ended in mistrials. In the second trial, then Governor Ross Barnett interrupted the proceedings while Myrlie Evers, Medgar Evers' wife, was actually in the middle of testifying, strode into the courtroom to personally shake hands with Beckwith. Such was the tradition of Mississippi. And despite that, these students were out protesting against racism and against the war in Vietnam. It was a very heroic thing that they did. Well, in response to the massacres, particularly at Kent and Jackson, there were explosions of protest all across the country. The mass anti-war movement became even greater and reached out into new sections of the population. On virtually every campus across the country, there were protests of one sort or another. Very typically at major universities, you had the birth of strike newspapers. And what began to happen was the development of a national student strike. Now, some people think that the national student strike, which became the largest protest in the history of this country, was caused by Kent and Jackson. It was not. It was caused by the many years of lies and watching the carnage in Southeast Asia. What was behind it was the hatred of the war in Vietnam and what Kent and Jackson were simply the spark that set it off. Most major universities were shut down, and students began to occupy the campuses, and actually, in some places, began to run the universities themselves. They drove the administrators out, began to make fundamental decisions about how the universities should be operated, what the curriculum should be, and things like that. I was the chairman of a group called the Committee of Kent State Massacre Eyewitnesses. We were traveling around the country trying to help knit together the National Student Strike, and I had a chance to go to a lot of campuses, speak at a lot of rallies. On campus after campus, you'd walk on, there'd be 1,000 students, 2,000 students, 5,000 students sitting in the middle of a mall, having a meeting, having discussions, having debate, no violence, no cops. For the first time in our lives, we saw what actual democracy looked like as it unfolded in real life. And we began to build what was called the anti-war university. And it was patterned after what had happened in France in May, June of 1968, which had had a big effect on a lot of radical thinking young people in this country. And what the French students did was they had what they called the Red University, and there was students went out on strike in 1968, and they marched to the factory gates, and the workers joined them, and eventually 10 million workers were out in France, and there was almost a revolution in France in 1968, and it had a tremendous impact on people all over Europe. It had a profound effect on young people that you see to this day. And we didn't think we could call it the Red University. We called it the Anti-War University, but the idea was the same. We used our base on the campus to reach out into new sections of the population and to try to bring them into the anti-war movement. So all across the country at campuses there would be strike centers and strike meetings, and what we tried to do was to go out and go to factories and leaflet, and go to, especially important, to military bases, to go to airports and train stations, to meet people, to hand out flyers, and to use our base at these occupied universities in order to create a much larger social movement. And it was a huge movement, and it involved hundreds of thousands, millions of students who became active, at least for a short period of time. Of course, most people don't stay active, but for a brief period of time, there were hundreds of thousands of students who were actively building the anti-Vietnam War movement. And the demonstrations began to get much bigger all over the country. And here you see a couple of demonstrations. I think this one is in Seattle. Students just walked off the campus. A couple of thousand students went, sat down the freeway, said, "We want the war to end." And this kind of thing was going on all over the place. I ended up in the University of Texas in Austin, because it was cheap to go to school there. I couldn't go back to Kent without getting arrested. So I ended up in Austin, and I happened to just be at the center of what became an incredible part of the anti-war movement, two parts of it. One was the Chicano movement, and the other was the movement of active duty GIs against the war in the Army itself. And this was an amazing thing. And what you're looking at here is a demonstration taking place right outside the gates of Fort Hood, one of the main demarcation places for Vietnam in Texas. And these are all active duty GIs marching against the war with a banner. And this is unprecedented in the history of the world, to have an anti-war movement like this going on during a shooting war. And it was students who were organized off the campuses, off places like the University of Texas, who went to the bases, who went and reached out to the GIs, who gave these brave soldiers the support that they so needed in order to build the movement, because it was these GIs, more than anything else, it was the movement against the war in the Army itself that led to the collapse of the U.S. war effort in Vietnam, because the soldiers simply refused to fight. It was led mostly by African American and Latino GIs, and they didn't have organizations, they didn't have political parties. All they had was their organic motion that they created in the field itself, in Vietnam, in the bases of America. It was one of the great moments of the history of the working class of this country, And having been part of that in some small way, having watched it grow, having watched it develop, nothing in this world, you will never convince me that human beings cannot change the world, because I saw them do it. I saw working people fundamentally make social change. Same thing happened with the Chicano movement. Chicanos were an integral part of the movement, of the anti-war movement off the campus. Hundreds of thousands of Spanish-speaking workers organized primarily through Raza Unida Party, which was a political party led by teenagers in South Texas. The growth of this movement involved hundreds of thousands of Latino workers in a very important component of the anti-war movement. And the anti-war movement simply became too powerful, and the U.S. was forced to withdraw from Vietnam and waged its military war through economic methods instead. Well, so what is the legacy of the massacres of Kent and Jackson? Well, despite the many promises that were made after the shootings, in fact, the truth is yet to be revealed about what happened at Kent. They really, really covered it up and went as far as they could. I was one of two students, this is me being sworn in to testify at the Presidential Commission on Campus Unrest, which was called the Scranton Commission, which did say that the shootings were unwarranted. But there has never been a real thorough revelation about what happened at Kent, who gave the orders to fire. We know that there were phone calls between Governor Rhodes and the White House. We know that they laid the political framework for the shootings. But no president, including Obama, has been willing to open the files and let us see what happened really at Kent State. So the legacy really is one that's a living legacy, because what we accomplished and what our martyrs in their brief lives accomplished was that they helped to build a movement that fundamentally changed history. Not only did they force the U.S. not only were we able to force the U.S. out of Vietnam, but we inspired great new social movements in the process. The women's movement, the gay movement, the environmental movement, the immigrants' rights movement. All of these movements came out of were incubated in the mass movement against the war in Vietnam, which was the largest political protest movement that had ever happened in United States history. The largest explicitly working class demonstration in the United States did not take place in the 1930s. It did not take place in the late 1800s. It did not take place at any other time. It actually happened in May Day of 2006. It was unprecedented, and many of the organizers of that movement were the children of Chicano activists who were involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. We are not criminals, we are workers. That demonstration was totally unprecedented in the history of this country, in the history of the world, where workers who are so vulnerable, who can be easily deported, came out in their millions to protest against their own conditions. And that happened just a few short years ago. The largest anti-war demonstration in the streets did not occur in the 1960s or the 1970s. It actually occurred in February 5th, prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. International protests of millions of people. The anti-war sentiment, the ruling class of this country has been able to make little gains against social movements in this country here or there. They've turned back some things about our right to have, for women to have abortions, for example. Without a mass feminist movement, we see that they've been able to make some progress. But they've never been able to make the slightest progress in turning around the anti-war sentiment that came out of Vietnam. The American people are more anti-war than at any time in their history. And that is the real legacy of Kent. And that's going to be very important, because the coming battles, and I'm going to wrap it up here,
And then
coming battles are going to make the 70s look very small, very much as a preliminary, as a little warm-up for the main event. Because the stakes are so much greater today. We were fighting to end the war. We were fighting for a new world. But today, in a sense, we're fighting to just hang on to the world that we have. Because this is not 1970, and today, the very existence of this planet and the human species is at stake. And that's the truth. The lunatics that run this country, in their quest for profits, will destroy this planet and everything that lives on it. That seems to be the course that they're bent on. And every new disaster that we face, they welcome joyfully as a chance to make more money. This is the world that we live in. But what we learned going through the course, earlier generation of the civil rights movement, and my generation through the course of fighting and winning to end the war in Vietnam, was that we have the power to stand up to them and win.
Well, thank you. And now we can talk a little bit about it. So what would you say are the big issues now that people should, there seem like so many, but what would be the major issues that people should be standing up and protesting?
Well, war is always the most fundamental question that faces the working class, because it's workers of one country slaughtering workers of another country for the benefit of the profits of their particular ruling classes. And we see what's going on in the world today, what's happening in the Ukraine, what's happening with Russia, the saber rattling against Russia, what's happening in the Middle East. And there's really, we've reached a stage of permanent war. Young people who live in the United States have never had a day without war. They don't even try to hide it anymore. The so-called war on terrorism is really a war against working people that takes place on a world scale. So that is always a very fundamental issue.
Do you think that the fact that we don't have a draft now has changed the ability of people who are on the front lines to protest?
Well, we have a draft. It's an economic draft.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so things are a little different. And this is a question that frequently comes up. Like, some people think if we had a draft today, then there'd be much larger demonstrations, and it may be that would be a contributing factor. But I don't believe that was what fundamentally motivated people in the anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s. Yes, we were all trying to avoid Vietnam, and people had a lot of different ways of doing that. But really, a lot of people, it was a moral decision. People were against the war. And they were against the war for all the right reasons. One of the right reasons to be against the war is because it gets you killed. And that is important. But people who march and demonstrate and organize are not doing it as some self-preservation thing. They're doing it because they made a decision that this is the right thing to do. This is what we do as human beings. We're social beings. We act socially. And it's one of our best features as human beings.
Now, a lot of students seem to not be as active as they were in the 60s and 70s. And I've heard it hypothesized that they have such a debt load that a lot of them are just scared. They finish college and they're $60,000, $70,000 and more in debt, and they don't want to wreck their job prospects.
Well, it's a very different future that they have, and for me going to school, for example, I didn't have to worry about that thing, and it wasn't an issue. And today, yes, students have become basically a debtor class to bankers. It's at Central Connecticut State University where I teach. It's a working class school. Students go there. They come out $30,000, $40,000 in debt, but they're never going to be able to pay it off. They're going to be paying bankers. It goes directly into the pockets of bankers.
And the students are paying very high interest rates.
Very high interest rates, and there's no jobs. And so you're going to pay them out of a low-wage job. And this does have a draining effect on people. First of all, they're working very long hours to go to school. They have 2 or 3 jobs. They're always looking for work. They don't have job prospects. So these economic things do weigh on students. However, I don't think that that is the fundamental reason that we don't see big street demonstrations today. I think there's something else that's going on, which is that there's a process that goes on before people act, and that is they think, and they learn, and they exhaust other possibilities. And what's happening today is that people are trying to solve social problems individually. You know, an art student goes into nursing because they think, well, there's not going to be a job, so I'll become a nurse. So now we got more nursing students in the United States, probably will be filled in the next 1,000 years. You know, everybody looks for individual solutions. This was very true prior to the labor upsurge of the 1930s, and it was even true prior to the student movement of the 1960s. People look for individual solutions. I'll go study here, I'll go do this. Oh, I should have taken computer programming, or everyone tries to solve these things individually. And that is just a process that goes on until people finally come to the point where they realize, oh, this is not, I can't solve this individually. There's no individual solution. There is no individual solution to student debt. There is no individual solution to unemployment. There is no individual solution to endless war. There is no individual solution to the destruction of the planet. There are only social solutions. The only thing that can solve these things is human solidarity. And eventually, I think, there will be something that sets it off, and we're going to see big new movements that address these things, which is exactly why all these draconian anti-democratic laws and prisons and all this kind of stuff that the ruling class is doing is going on today. Because you have to ask yourself, there's 800 new spying organizations in the United States. You know, who are they spying against? Well, they're getting ready for the future. They know that social unrest is coming. Ruling class is not stupid. They have smart people working in think tanks, and they know that eventually the people whose homes are being repossessed and whose homes are being flooded by rising waters and whose kids can't get jobs and everything are going to rise up. It's people will fight eventually. And so we got some big battles coming. And I happen to be very optimistic about and have a lot of confidence in the students today. You know, a lot of students look back at these times and justly, and I'm glad they do, look at these demonstrations and the counterculture movements and all this stuff, and they think, wow, that was really great. And it was, and it was a good time too. And there tends to be a little nostalgia about that. And we forget some things. You know, we forget that this was before the women's movement. This was before the gay movement. That sometimes people didn't have such progressive ideas.
Actually, there was huge generational divide. I had left the country by 1970, but I was around for most of 1969, and during the election in which Nixon was elected. You know, we young people felt really like a hated class. Honestly, it was like they were you know, the powers that be were at war with anyone under 20.
Yeah, and the students today are much more, even the students who don't consider themselves an activist or even political in any way, are much more conscious of what's going on in the world than we ever were. They're so much more knowledgeable. I mean, and we all are. I mean, Tahrir Square, you sit and you watch it unfold on your computer. You know, I'm yelling at my computer, yeah, watch out, the cops are coming. You know, and this was not the case in the 1960s and 70s. You know, you found out about something a month after it occurred by reading an obscure newspaper if you were lucky enough to get one. And students today are much more aware of what's going on in the world. They're much more able to work with each other and to build coalitions in a different kind of way. They're much more open to ideas. They're really much better prepared for big political battles that are coming than we were. And so that makes me very optimistic. Now, you know, they don't have the experience yet, but they'll get it.
And I worry too, the internet has been so instrumental in getting information out, and of course with net neutrality under attack successfully, it's hard to know what the future will hold. But we have only about 3 more minutes, so I wanted to ask if you thought that the destruction of our planet piece of this could really be a unifying theme for everyone on the planet.
Well, you would think so, wouldn't you? You would think that this would, I'm not a scientist, and I must say, in the 60s, I always said, you know, I now realize mistaken opinion was, you know, that capitalism, in order to make profits, will not destroy the own planet. But in fact, I think Lenin was proven correct in this. He said that the capitalists will sell you the rope that you're going to hang them with, you know. And these people cannot stop themselves. They really can't. They are driven on this carbon-based idiocy, this nuclear idiocy. They can't stop themselves. And you would think that it would be the unifying factor. I mean, I think it is. It's not that working people need convincing about this. It's just that we need to come together and to actually create leaders and create organizations that can speak for us. And that's a process that can be very long and painful. But, you know, in 1928, the stock market crashed, and for years people just went around and they beat each other up trying to get a job at a factory. But by 1937, you had mass sit-down strikes. And if anyone had said in a few months before May of 1970 that there was going to be a mass student strike and students were going to take over the universities, people thought you were crazy. But this is when it happens. So right now, things seem pretty bleak in a lot of ways. That makes me optimistic that something good's going to happen soon.
And people will come together. Well, thank you, Mike, for coming on.
My
a lot
pleasure.
of food for thought. Sorry, all of you out there, we didn't really have time for phone calls, but, you know, there's an event page on Facebook, and if people want to comment, you're welcome to. I think it might end up being an ongoing dialogue.
That'd be great.
So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe next year when it's the 45th anniversary, we'll come and revisit the state of the world then.
Well, it's a good thing for us to remember these events. They can try to ignore us, but we need to make it part of our collective consciousness.
Well, thank you again, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Ronna.
Thank you.
When I sit in contemplation of the human situation, I often feel a certain sense of pride. Our achievements are many and mighty, and the evidence cannot be denied. But my reverie is shaken, for my thoughts are often taken to a tragedy that happened long ago, when there roamed through this land beings awesome and grand, the fabulous dinosaurs. They were creatures of a manner quite reptilian in their unique and stylish way, and their numbers could be counted in the millions, though there's zero of these heroes in the world today. They had music, art, and fashion. They had dinosauric passion, and I think they'd be enraged and mortified that when they're mentioned today, it's only to say their brains were small and they died. Wah, 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 wah. Their brains were small and they died. Now perhaps some asteroid that Mother Earth could not avoid became the agent of their premature demise. Well, I know that these things can happen, so who are we to criticize when we'll pay most any price to have the ultimate device that ensures the perfect global suicide? I would venture instead that the humanoid head is where the tinier brain resides. And when we're gone, our works begin to crumble until nothing can be found. In 10 million years, some other guys will stumble on our fossils, and some fellow will begin to expound in a scientific study to his cockroach science buddies that the evidence cannot be denied. They were big, dumb, and slow. They couldn't go with the flow. Their brains were small and they died. Wah, 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 wah. Their brains were small and they died.